Thanks so much. And I really appreciate everyone being here. And I want to be clear that what I'm sharing today is kind of a model that we're trying out. And we're in the process, like this thing is up and running. But I'm really keen to hear any ideas that people have here about ideas for stimulating more participation or tweaks to the program. And of course, everyone's welcome to take this model and iterate it on their own as well. Today, I'll just briefly touch on, for those of you who don't know Lumen, I'm just going to do a couple quick slides just so you know a little bit about Lumen's background. And then I want to talk about more of the mechanics of the program, and it's rooted in the way that we're using analytics, learning analytics, to find parts of OER that aren't working out well, and then just touch on the structure and the processes in the grant program. So 12 years ago, our co-founders at Lumen, that's Kim Thanos and David Wiley, received a great grant from the Gates Foundation to improve outcomes for students by adopting, how to encourage faculty to adopt open content. And in that initial program, it was called the Kaleidoscope program, many lessons were learned. They were working with 8 different partner institutions, and they just learned what some of the stumbling blocks were in getting faculty to make the move. So then a couple of years later, in 2012, they were awarded a second grant from Gates, but also a little bit from Shuttleworth to kind of work with those lessons learned and kind of iterate upon that. So today, Lumen is still partially owned by a charitable foundation. We're still focused on improving outcomes, especially for racially minoritized and low-income students. And using OER is still a cornerstone to our approach. And just to be clear, all of the materials that we make, we also publish openly and under a CC BY license. So a little bit about why we're engaging in the continuous improvement. Everyone I think that's here is aware of, that reference to repositories is kind of like OER graveyards. People put all this effort into making that initial version of it, and oftentimes it goes and it lives someplace, and then, over time, either it becomes inaccurate or there's things that, drift from it. So Lumen is really concentrated on kind of like focusing on a certain number of courses. And what we're trying to do is figure out a way to make sure that we're taking advantage of the fact that this is openly licensed and improving things along the way. But so to make those improvements, we have to be willing to, set forth the possibility that the first version isn't the best version, or that context changes and it needs to be changed. So it requires some honesty and humility. But to identify, like when you're looking at an entire course, where do you start? How do you approach it? We believe that it's all about collecting and analyzing just relevant data to find those parts of the course that are less effective. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then it's having a program in place where we can actually, make changes in those areas. So we do have a small team that's dedicated to the continuous improvement of our OER, and that's based on suggestions we get from the community, as well as when we work with faculty to review certain materials. And then once you make those changes, you've got to have a way to know if your changes are actually improvements, right? Because we might be, making these changes and maybe it looks better, maybe it's more up to date, but is it actually more effective? That's the question we're trying to answer. So now I'll shift a little bit to the mechanics on how we identify in our OER where students appear to be struggling the most. So it all begins with the fact that all of Lumen's courses are designed, on a highly structured learning outcomes, and we associate all of the content and practice to each of the learning outcomes. So for instance, in our Waymaker course, this is kind of a nice visualization of the outcomes. So it's like introduction to business is, this dot in the middle, and that's made up of 18 primary outcomes, which would be like module level or maybe like chapter level, right? And then within each of those, there's 93 what we call enabling outcomes. And then finally, that is made up of the very specific 308 skill level outcomes. And this is on average how, about what a Lumen course looks like. And, it's not unusual. Most college level courses probably have this level of outcomes. But the advantage of having everything nested and mapped in such a way is that we associate now each one of these outside dots on the outer ring here, each one of those, which we'll represent by this yellow dot here, we have tagged and aligned to, the reading and the interactives and the videos that are presented, as well as assessment, formative assessment items, different practice activities, and a summative assessment. And especially the summative assessment allows us now to say, oh, okay, now we're going to be able to look at how much are students actually using all of the practice and learning part of the OER, and then how are they doing on the evaluation at the end. So we collect this data from the students, and we can map it on a graph such as this, where engagement with the aligned learning materials means every time, the number of times we see students click into a particular page and use it, mapped here along the horizontal axis, and then how they do on that summative assessment. So what you would expect then is that the more the students use the OER, the better they're going to do on the final assessment, right? That's our assumption and our hypothesis. So we might find that students are actually not using the materials very much, but still doing really well. And that might be because it's like an easy part of the course, or it's something that's really common knowledge, or the student had some prior experience with the materials, something like that. But where we really want to pay attention is where it looks like the students are actually using the OER, but they're not doing great on the summative assessment. Because that's when we say, okay, there's something wrong with the materials here, because it looks like the students are using it, but they're not doing well on the assessment. And that's where we're going to concentrate our efforts. So this is a kind of a for instance of when we map all of the outcomes and how all the students are doing semester by semester. What we do is we get some of these outcomes that are in this fourth quadrant here that says like, okay, these are the ones that we are going to look at. So in order to, so that's like where we start. That identifies where in the OER we want to concentrate our efforts. And to make these improvements, we've got to have the power of OER that gives us permission to make the changes. And then we've got to have those learning analytics that tell us where to look to make the changes. That's how we're approaching our continuous improvement work. And so like I was trying to explain a little earlier, making the changes is now easy because we've got the open licenses and we've got the people to make those changes. But knowing if those things are actual improvements requires us to conduct a test of some kind, actually see if it's moved the needle in the right way. So we've devised some machinery that we can actually present students, half the students in a given semester who are using our materials, with 2 different iterations of the content. They're not going to be radically different, but they're going to be different pedagogical approaches so that they're still tied to the outcome. Great. So in the Improve It challenge, what we're trying to do is garner some help and some diversity in the kind of changes that are being made, not just using our own in-house people, but encouraging people to help us. So we've got all these other areas where I've checked the boxes, but we're looking to the community for some help and some insights in making the changes. So what we did in the spring, we did our first iteration of this where we invited anyone to put together a very short proposal. It was meant to be just kind of like a one-page thing just to express what you're thinking. And we asked people to touch on instructional design principles, tell us about some research that you're going to base this in, make sure you're paying attention to accessibility as well as diversity, equity, inclusion ideas. And we show them a rubric. This is how you're going to be judged. We want to be transparent about that, helping them guide this as well. And then what we've done is we share out the top 10 outcomes that need help across 5 courses. So we started with just 2 outcomes per course. And we got 17 proposals this spring, and they were for 7 different outcomes. And we were able to select, we got 2 graduate students, which we love to see. We got 3 faculty from large research universities, one of which was an HBCU, and then 2 faculty from community colleges that are both kind of serve at-risk students as well. And we've given each of those 7 people $250 to support them in actually now doing the changes. And then what we'll do is in the fall, we're going to test it and we're going to see how it performs. And if we can identify statistically significant improvement, we're going to offer a bonus grant of $2,500. And we are hoping that that is something that, you know, tickle people's minds and will motivate people to make the changes that are there. So again, I just, you know, kind of airing this project, we're hoping, you know, ways to kind of spur and sustain the kind of improvements we want to see. But I'd love to hear from any of you what insights or what changes or what things you find could be better on this. So thanks, guys.